Welcome. Good afternoon. Good morning if you're somewhere else. I'd like to first of all, thank you for all of you for joining us today for this exciting opportunity to highlight the work of those on the front line of the challenges of climate change. My name is Frances Guy. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Scotland's International Development Alliance. It's Scotland's network of a wide range of organisations working for sustainable global development. We're a membership body for everyone committed to creating a fairer world, free from poverty, injustice and environmental threats. And our members work in more than 100 countries. Action on climate change is a key part of what they do. And it highlights global connections, the essential link between everything we do domestically in Scotland and the impact that has on communities elsewhere in the world. We're here today to launch Facing the Crisis, a new digital exhibition that explores the impacts of the climate crisis on people and communities across the world. And I hope that some of you, if not most of you, might already have had a look at some of the wonderful pictures and stories that form part of the exhibition. The images and films have been submitted to us by our members and their partners over the last 6 months. And our aim in the run-up to COP26 is to highlight some of the challenges facing people and communities around the world, but also to showcase the great work in adaptation and mitigation carried out by people and communities across the global south, demonstrating to the rest of the world what's possible as we all seek to adapt to the changes going on around us. We also hope to underline the reality that those most affected by climate change are those who have contributed the least to the carbon emissions that have brought the change about. We'll be exploring some of these inequities in our discussions this afternoon. Please do look at the exhibition on www.facingthecrisis.scot. And for those of you who tweet, please do share your favorite images using hashtag Facing the Crisis. And in case you need an extra incentive, which I'm sure you don't, until the stocks run out, everyone who shares an image using that hashtag Facing the Crisis will receive a free copy of Graeme Maxton's book, A Chicken Can't Lay a Duck Egg, How COVID-19 Can Solve the Climate Crisis. We'll be hearing more from Graeme shortly. I'd like to thank all those who have sent in their photos and stories and encourage anyone with a story to tell to send us some more so that we can make this exhibition grow. Above all, I would like to thank WaterAid, SCIAF, Scottish Catholic International Aid Fund, Mercy Corps and Tear Fund for their help in making this exhibition possible. We're going to do this event in 2 parts. The first panel will kick off with a discussion about the broader issues that are driving the need for climate change globally, for climate justice globally, and Scotland's role in helping to address these inequalities. That discussion will be moderated by Yankho Mataya from WaterAid. Then we will show some of the highlights from the exhibition itself and have a focused discussion from some of the participants about the issues raised and what that means for all of us. That second discussion will be moderated by Maggie Nguyera from Trocaire, Malawi, who coordinates the Climate Challenge program there. But we do want this event to be as interactive as possible. So we'd like to encourage you all to make your comments and questions throughout this event. And please put your questions in the Q&A box. So just to be clear, put any questions in the Q&A box, but please feel free to make any comments or to introduce yourselves in the chat box so that others can see who's here and where you are. And to start, we're going to begin by showing a short film from the exhibition that was submitted by WaterAid.
It is 3:30 a.m. and Belita is leaving her home to begin her long journey to work. She is heading around 30 kilometers into the nearby Lake Chira to a marketplace known as Ntila. Recently, Lake Chira has been drying up quicker than ever before because of climate change. Market traders like Belita have to travel for hours to reach Ntila in the dry season.
Timatenga masafuria, nkuni, mpunga, ndi mazi. Ndikumagulisa mpunga, koma sitimagulisa wandiwo kunoko, timagulisa wapha. Koma masiku anomwina tingobwera ndi 25. Kwa mavenda atani, apita timatisangalasa kugulisa kwa kamodzi nthawi imodzi ndalama zambiri. Ndiye sitimapita kumene kuchera. Kuli chiopsezo chambiri, ndiye kuti mmene kwaphwerera pamene patikangobwera kufika ku nyumba timakhala m'mavuto kwambiri. Timasowa mtengo ugwira. Chifukwa ganyu mmene tili pa khomo ndi ana sitinganyamuke pano pita ku ganyu tikubwera ndi chani 1000 ndi mmene chavutira chimanga. Vuto lilipo. Mkomberowu suli bwino. Ndiye kumafulumira madzi kutani kuthawa kwambiri. Kana khala kuti mwina mwake mkombero ndi wachilungamo mwina pano mkanatipezera tili kutunda kokucha.
Nyanja ikafika kunoko ngoti mabizinesi ina iliyonse imasika pansi oloso ageni wasikuti amapindula kwambiri yayi kunoko ngati akati mmene kunama kuti kunyanja sikuti kumakhalako zimbuzi amangochita chimbuzi pena paliponse ndiye chifukwa chake kolera ikabuka ifa atha kubwera mulendo oti sanakhalepo kunyanja kufika kumene kuchesa maziwa kuti kodi chikuchitika ndi chani. Inazagwa kolera kunoko kuti wina aliyese pasiku paja mwina timatha kutenga mitembo ija kapena 10.
The impact of climate change at the lake is devastating. Jobs are lost, families are displaced, and worse, people die.
Chaka chatha ndi nyengo mene inali ndi njala je sindinalima. Ndimapanga zopulumusa moyo wanga ndachananga. Nangokera pang'ono ndikupeza matumba awiri. Kuma chaka chino ndayesesa kuti moyo wanga undilime. Mwina anawo ngati ngakhale ndi mwayi. Mwina azaona kukoma kusoko.
Under a scorching sun, Belita has to endure another 3-hour cycle back home so that she can take care of her 7 children.
Well, I hope you saw that better than I did. I hope it was just my internet. But if you did see it well, I think it really puts into perspective the day-to-day realities of climate change on communities everywhere. It's my great pleasure to hand over to Yankho to moderate this first session. Yankho is an international development expert and regional funding manager at WaterAid. Yankho has seen at firsthand the impact of climate change in the Southern Africa region through droughts, floods, erratic rainfall, and declining water quality and quantity. She believes that joint efforts are critical in responding to the climate crisis facing our world today. Over to you, Yankho.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Francis, for that excellent introduction and starting off with a video from Malawi, where I happen to be based, and from WaterAid, where I am working as the regional funding manager. It's really facing the crisis, and I can definitely say that Malawi is one of many examples of how the climate crisis is impacting low-income countries across the world. And I'm sure you're able to appreciate the glaring inequalities as communities who have done little is affecting them are struggling to survive. Leading up to COP26, it's important that we all understand the implications of the decisions that our world leaders will be making that affect the lives of millions like Belita that we saw in the video, living at the margins of society. In this session today, we're going to be linking the broader issues of international development and climate action to the personal stories presented at CEDA's exhibition, and we will ask ourselves the broad question: why is climate justice important, and what does that mean for all of us here today? I would like to encourage us all to visit the event webpage Just to help us understand a little bit more about climate justice, to understand what COP26 is, and why COP26 is particularly important. Climate justice is about acknowledging and responding to the social, economic, and public health inequalities brought on by climate change. At COP26, which is going to be held in Glasgow this year, countries are going to be submitting new as well as increased nationally determined contributions, which state how they will all make greater domestic contributions towards the global effort. Above everything, it is an opportunity for high-income countries, where some of us come from, to demonstrate their leadership by challenging themselves to do more in the interest of climate justice for lower-income countries, as we have seen in the video. I'd like to invite you to visit the page, and you will see much more content relating to these thematic areas. I have the pleasure today of being joined from different of the corners of the world by Jamie Livingston, Sandra Ramirez, as well as Graeme Maxton, who are going to be sharing with us their perspectives and their experiences on climate justice and on climate action. Jamie has been a print and broadcast journalist, including political correspondent on STV News. He is now the head of Oxfam, overseeing policy, advocacy, campaigns, and communications, as well as project activity. He is also currently director of Stop Climate Chaos Scotland and plays a leading role within the Disasters Emergency Committee in Scotland. It's an honor to introduce Sandra Ramirez, who is a devoted human rights defender from rural Colombia. Sandra places herself at great risk of persecution for her work fighting for climate justice and citizen participation in human rights amidst extreme socioeconomic inequality and illegal armed groups endangering communities in Colombia. Last, but certainly not least, I have the pleasure of introducing Graeme Maxton, who is an economist and internationally acclaimed author with publications in more than 20 language editions. He is an advisory board member on the UN's Energy Pathways Project and of Population Matters. Previously, Graeme was Secretary General of the Club of Rome in Switzerland and a regional director with the Economist Group in Asia. It's exciting to have you all here today. I'd like to invite you to introduce yourselves to the audience. Jamie, if you may go first.
Thank you, Yankho, and hi everyone. It's great to be here. I first really want to give credit to the Alliance for pulling this exhibition together. So often images speak louder than words, and it's a really powerful group of images. For Oxfam, climate justice is so important because our vision is a world without poverty, and yet we know that the climate crisis is making that so much harder to achieve. And as we've heard, it's the poorest people paying the price. But it's equally clear that those very same people did very little and often nothing at all to contribute to the crisis. Indeed, our analysis is showing that the emissions of the richest 1% globally are in fact more than double those of the poorest half of the world put together. So we must simultaneously confront this extreme carbon inequality while supporting those already paying the price. And those are two core priorities for climate justice in Scotland. Because as a rich country, a country that got rich on the back of burning fossil fuels, our biggest priority, of course, has to be to stop making this crisis any worse. Positively, at a time when global emissions continue to rise, Scotland's emissions have halved since 1990, and we have some of the strongest legal targets and monitoring frameworks of any developed country. Yet we do need to be honest, we are not cutting emissions quickly enough. Indeed, we've missed our last 3 annual targets in a row. But while cutting emissions is essential, that isn't enough either, not when people are already suffering, as we just saw in that powerful film. Indeed, I saw that for myself in Malawi during the drought back in 2016. And when I think about climate justice, I immediately think of a woman called Jennifer Nkotima, who I met there. She was 24. She was looking after her 3 orphan nephews, working for their maize crop, their only source of food and their only source of income had withered due to the drought. And for them, the idea of climate justice felt pretty much hopeless, hopelessly far away. Back in 2009, rich countries promised to give developing countries some $100 billion every year to help them cope with the impacts of climate change and to reduce their own emissions. That promise is really the glue that holds the entire Paris Agreement together, yet it's coming badly unstuck and communities are being left unsupported. So it's great that the Scottish Government, as a sub-state actor, is doubling its climate justice fund. That's small, but hugely positive and sends out a really strong message. And just finally, we here in Scotland, Stop Climate Chaos, of which I'm on the board, alongside the Scottish Government, recently hosted the Glasgow Climate Dialogues. And we need to be mindful that some impacts are now irreversible from climate change. Indeed, we heard from one participant from Bangladesh who told us that we've entered the era of loss and damage. He said it's going to get worse, not better, that every year is going to be worse than the year before. Every day is going to bring something new. So cutting emissions fairly, but quickly, and boosting support to those impacted, two core priorities for climate justice.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Over to you, Sandra.
Thank you, Jan. I'm so delighted to be participating in this event. My name is Sandra Ramirez. I'm a human rights defender in Colombia. I'm a rural habitant and I have a degree in political science and public administration. Also, I have some trainings in sustainability, agroecology, and rural development. Because of my work in human rights, I'm currently a fellow in the program for human rights defenders in the University of Dundee. And my work is based on promoting and defending human rights in the most vulnerable rural communities in the south of Colombia. I belong to a peasant association. I am currently the spokesperson of this association. In this association, we work with peasant families and indigenous communities. We seek to create environmental awareness in small producers, making a transition from conventional production to agroecological process, returning to our ancestral knowledge, protecting biodiversity, water bodies, and wild species. We try to improve the livelihoods of families through productive projects. My work is focused in land rights, the right to a healthy environment, women empowerment, children protection, the right to live in peace, and the strategies to address the sustainable development goals in our daily routines. So different workshops, we create awareness about the challenges by climate change and the importance of the communities in climate action. When we talk about climate change and we think about the urgent actions, we need to talk about supporting the communities of countries like Colombia, which ancestrally have been the protectors of the environment. We are the ones that generate the least environmental footprint, but they are the most affected by the climate crisis. To speak about climate justice for me is to understand that rural communities in Colombia face different risks by the economic interests of big corporations, by the historical violence from legal and illegal armed groups, by the lack of access to basic services of water, energy, health, and education, and also by the isolation and the lack of protection by the Colombian state. When we talk about climate justice, we must address the urgent need to ensure the human rights of these communities. But we also need to talk about the protection of community leaders who work in defense of rights in the territories and who are being persecuted, attacked, and killed systematically.
Thank you very much, Sandra, and it's a pleasure to have you on the panel today. I would now like to hand over to Graeme.
Thank you, and good evening from Taipei. What causes climate change? Well, as we all know, there are three main causes: burning fossil fuels, farming, the way we grow food, and deforestation. But what stops us changing? We know that climate change is very serious, we know that it's very urgent, but we still don't do anything to make a big difference. We're not doing anything to slow the pace of climate change. The situation today is worse than it's ever been, and it's getting worse every year. Why don't we do enough? And I think one of the biggest problems is that not enough people understand what's actually happening. If they did, if they really understood how serious and urgent the problem was, then there would be change. And that's why I'm so keen to support this initiative. Facing the crisis is helping people understand how big this problem is. Scotland hasn't had much of an impact from climate change. The UK hasn't had much of an impact from climate change. It's been very lucky. There have been more storms and more extreme weather. There's been more flooding. There have been more wildfires. There's been a loss of some seabirds and other animals, and there's been a loss of natural habitats. But the impact on the rest of the world is much bigger. It's huge. Those of you in Europe will have seen the pictures this summer in Germany and Belgium of the enormous floods and the effects of those floods there that have killed hundreds of people. You'll also perhaps remember the pictures of the floods in China where people were trapped underground in subway trains. You'll have seen the pictures of the wildfires in California, the wildfires in Turkey and Spain and Greece. But other places have even bigger problems. There are terrible droughts in Africa, as we've heard and as we've seen. There are terrible droughts in South America, particularly in Argentina, in Central Asia. In India, many of the biggest cities face running out of water within the next decade. In Indonesia and Java, sea levels have risen so much that some people can only be buried when they die, when the tide goes out. In California and New York, people are now painting the streets white to try and increase the level of reflectivity and cool urban temperatures. And in Siberia, on the Yamal Peninsula, the permafrost has melted so much that the gases which have been trapped beneath for tens of thousands of years are now coming up and exploding, creating huge craters, some of them 50 meters across. They're also releasing anthrax spores, which have infected reindeer herds and people. So I'm very keen to support this event because I think it'll help people understand how bad the situation is and why there needs to be radical change. Because when people understand, there can be change. It's very important to know what that change needs to be, however. I watched one of the videos this afternoon and I saw the scheme to give people in Malawi, farmers in Malawi, advance notice of storms. This is great. This really helps people on the ground. But it doesn't stop climate change. People in the rich world have an enormous responsibility. We have a duty to help those whose lives are being destroyed by climate change. It's not very well known, but historically, the UK has created more emissions per head than almost any other country in the world. We have a particularly big responsibility in the UK to see that there's climate justice. But we have to remember what the focus of the problem is, and that's fossil fuels, farming, and deforestation, as I said at the beginning. And for Scotland, to me, the opportunity for leadership is clear. If Scotland really wants to make a difference, it has to shut the oil and gas industry, no matter how ridiculous and unlikely that seems. Scotland mustn't follow the path of Norway and pay billions to stop deforestation elsewhere, but carry on pumping out oil and gas. You can't solve a problem by making it worse. So if we really want to help, we need to tackle the problem at home. We need to learn about what's happening. We need to understand what's happening in the rest of the world. And we need to ensure that there is climate justice. But we need to do much more. We need to do everything we can to make Scotland carbon free.
Thank you very much, Graeme. Great to have you on the panel today. So some interesting themes that we already see coming up from what our panelists have shared so far, that climate change is a global problem. It's shared and it's for everybody, but it's affecting us in different parts of the world differently. And even in our unique contexts, we are not all experiencing the impacts in the same way, neither are we able to cope with the impacts in the same way. The conversation today, and I hope that the inspiration that we get from our panelists is going to get each and every single one of us thinking carefully about what climate change is to us and what is our role in the climate discourse. What do we need to be doing? What are some of the practical actions that we can take as individuals, as countries, to mitigate these impacts for those that need it the most? If I may borrow the words of Graeme, that where do we need the change to happen? And that is something that we will be thinking about today. So I would like to get us started off on our conversation. Do feel free, as Francis had initially indicated, to put your questions in the Q&A box, but also to put any comments that you might have in the chat, and to participate as much as possible. There are some links going up of some of the interesting content that was part of the exhibition, and you can follow those. And of course, don't forget to tweet when you have the opportunity to do so, and to get a free book of Graeme's latest book. So starting with you, Graeme, please share with us what climate justice means in the context of global climate action. And can you share with us whether COVID-19 has changed this narrative of climate justice in this global context? Over to you.
Okay, thank you. I think we have to be very careful with what we mean by climate justice. First of all, I think it's important that we're not distracted from the main task, which has to be stopping emissions. Stopping emissions has to be the #1 priority. We also need to be careful not to think that we can compensate people for the damage that's been caused, that we can decide what's best. It's a bit colonial, if you don't mind me saying so, to think that we can cause all this damage and then somehow offer some sort of financial recompense. And we can't compensate people who have no home, who have no food and no hope. What we have to do is stop making the situation worse, so the number of people without hope doesn't continue to grow. Has COVID changed this? I mean, in many ways it has. It's shown, certainly rich world societies, that they can cut emissions quickly when they need to. It's shown that people can be paid to stay at home, and that makes it possible to pay people during a transition from an unsustainable system to a sustainable one. It's also helped make people in the rich world, I think, question the system. They begin to understand that working long hours and buying lots of stuff they don't need is actually not necessary. But in the last 6 months, perhaps, the system's fought back, and there's an enormous pressure to go back to normal. And that's taking us in the wrong direction again. And what I'm hoping from COP26 is that we can build this momentum, this strength of collective activism to push us back in the right direction again. That's what I hope we can get here.
Thank you, Graeme. And if I may direct a question to Sandra, please share with us, Sandra, what climate justice means in the context of your work in Colombia.
Yeah, as I said, the Colombian rural communities are isolated. They are trying to face the issues, supporting each other through associative processes, searching for better conditions that let them face the crisis. Many of them believing in the peace agreements become substitution of crops from cocaine and heroin crops to coffee or cocoa crops, and implementing many international standards as organic or agroecology production in order to protect the soil, to protect the air, to protect the water bodies, and protecting the biodiversity and the wild species. But without warranties and by the displacement that they are suffering, because many interests, economical and violent interests, these groups are disappearing. So for us, it's so important to get on board the Scotland community to support the activities that we are doing in our country and in countries like mine in Latin America. And there are many ways how you can contribute. You can share in our voices. Let the world knows that Colombia is not a country in peace, as many countries are thinking, that we are facing big risks caused by the economic interests of big multinational companies, also by the narco-traffic, by the corruption in the governments, and by the natural disasters that we are facing daily. We are losing our families in the floods, and all time we are losing our crops, and also the soils are suffering because the agrochemical industry is making big pressure in our ancestral customs to produce our crops. And also you can support, including Colombia, in the Scottish agenda. Have deals between countries could make pressure of the Colombian local governments to take action about the issues in the rural communities. But you also can support creating the links in order to the communities can have training and technical and financial support in sustainable projects to face the crisis, to obtain water clean for human consumption, to obtain sustainable energy like solar energy or another kind of like wind or with wind or with water, to ensure that basic service for these communities, to strengthen these communities and to guarantee for them equity in the access of the human rights. But also you can help and support caring the Colombian humanitarian leaders as me to strengthen our skills and to ensure what we can support the communities in better and safer ways.
Thank you, Sandra. And from what you can share, I can clearly see how low-income countries find themselves in a bit of a crossroads or a balancing act to find that sweet spot between them coping with the impacts of climate change to a great extent that have been caused by higher income countries, whilst at the same time mitigating their own contributions and still somehow managing to facilitate the development and meeting access to basic needs, as you have rightly mentioned. So I hope that this is a really good point for reflection to appreciate that the complexity of the climate crisis is far much more than simply reducing, but also about meeting the multiple demands that countries are faced with depending on their social and economic disposition. I would like to move on to Jamie just to get some perspectives from you in terms of how a small country like Scotland contributes to global climate action and supports climate justice.
Well, I mean, I think fundamentally we need to be saying the right things and doing the right things. I agree very much with what Graeme was saying, and that the biggest single thing is getting on track to cut our emissions quickly. And to pick up on what we've just heard, rich countries have to move furthest and fastest on this. We've got an obligation to do just that, because aiming high, as Scotland undoubtedly is, and falling short could perhaps be excused in other circumstances, but not in relation to the climate crisis. It's costing lives. So we badly need to get on track and make sure we miss no more annual targets. And that gives us the credibility to say to others that it not only should be done, but it can be done. And right now, if we add up all the kind of policy commitments globally, the world is on track for warming of 3.1 degrees by the end of this century. Now, words like catastrophic wouldn't do that justice. So that's why, even though we're small in terms of our emissions, we need Scotland to get on track and then to credibly champion others. And we've heard new commitments in the programme for government, which are encouraging, though there are questions over the speed and depth of those commitments. And we're also promised a catch-up plan from the Scottish Government after the last missed target. That has to come forward quickly, because otherwise the 2030 target, far less the 2045 target, moves massively out of reach. And it will take bravery. Graeme mentioned oil and gas, and right now there are damaging plans to give the go-ahead to a new oil field off the coast of Shetland. Now, the First Minister has rightly written to the Prime Minister asking that all existing licenses, as well as new ones, are sense-checked against our climate aspirations. But we certainly think Scotland and the Scottish Government should go further and make their own opposition to that proposal clear, because drilling for new oil and gas at a time when the climate emergency is pushing more people into hunger and poverty is clearly incompatible and wrong. And we also need to show bravery in other ways too, and that's about speeding up our climate action by taxing high incomes and wealth, given the clear evidence that shows that the richest in society have not just caused, but are continuing to fuel this crisis. And doing these things would not just send a message that climate justice is a matter of science or technology, but it's actually about justice, about people who are causing the crisis paying for the climate action that we need to be put in place quickly and urgently. The only other point I would make is that having done these things, the Scottish Government can raise its voice, and it's trying to do that. It's published what it describes as an indicative nationally determined contribution. Now, that's something that all countries arriving in Glasgow need to do, but the Scottish Government didn't need to. It's a sub-state actor. But the fact of putting Scotland's climate action and targets into the language of the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC does matter, and it's a really good thing. And not only that, using Scotland's soft power to amplify the priorities of the Global South through things like the Glasgow Climate Dialogues, which was specifically designed to amplify and give prominence to the priorities of the Global South before COP26. These things really matter. And I would really urge everybody to take a look at the communique that flowed from those Glasgow Climate Dialogues that was released just last week.
Thank you very much, Jamie. I would like to, I guess, pull out two questions that we have that have popped in the Q&A. Thank you, Graeme, for responding to the first one, but it does speak to this last point you're making in terms of the need for multi-sector involvement to address the climate crisis. The first specific question that was asked was around how politicians tend to bury their heads in the sand, in a sense, because what tends to happen is that they do everything to avoid people understanding, and this was with reference to the point that Graeme had made, that a lot of people don't understand, and you have rightly said that the people that cause the challenge, the problems, usually are not even aware of the impact that this is having, especially on those who are most vulnerable to them. And the second question that came in was around the role of education and what it has in terms of building resilience to climate change. Also considering that SDG 4 on education is unlikely to be met, which is speaking to how much the progress of the other sustainable development goals also matters for the progress that we make in terms of addressing the climate justice. So if you can just give us some quick reflections on the role of multi-sector, looking at political sectors, education sectors, and many others in addressing the climate crisis, specifically in terms of climate justice. Over to you.
Okay. There's an enormous amount of effort being put into doing nothing. I think one of the greatest crimes is people talking about carbon neutrality, being net zero in 2050. There's a whole generation of politicians who are going around saying, let's be net zero in 2050, by which time they'll be long retired and it'll be too late. Being net zero in 2050, don't bother, because if we haven't fixed this problem within the next 10 years, then it's too late. I don't think people understand exactly how fast the chemistry is changing here. We're releasing carbon dioxide, which is increasing the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere by about 4 parts per million every year. And in less than 10 years, we will hit 450 parts per million, which is the same concentration as the planet had more than 3 million years ago. Now, I'm not suggesting that in 10 years' time, the planet's temperature will go back to the way it was 10 or 3 million years ago, but it will be on track to do that. We have to stop releasing all these gases, and that means cutting back on the emissions, and that means closing sectors of the economy. We can't do it through clever financing or carbon capture or any of the other clever ideas that are being put forward, and we certainly can't do it from something like net zero in 2050. We have to be much more serious, but the politicians, the people in charge, don't want to change the system because they're making money out of it today. So we have to be much more radical. When you talk about education, again, the problem is the urgency. Yes, we need to educate people, we need people to understand, but we need them to understand that they need to change the system now by whatever means they can. This is a very urgent, very serious problem. We don't have time to muck about.
Thank you very much, Graeme. And a final question to Sandra. We are clear that the biggest investments towards coping against the climate crisis needs to go into those who are most vulnerable, primarily in low-income countries. But the question is, what can these countries themselves do as part of promoting climate justice, as well as part of their own mitigating and coping mechanisms to the climate crisis? A quick response from you, Sandra.
Yeah, it's not an easy work to do for these communities because, as I said, they are isolated, they are without any kind of protection from the institutions, from the another communities. And also we have this situation, this big issue to access to education in rural communities, and the gap in terms of virtual gap or connection gap is going big and big with the time. So for the communities in Colombia to try to mitigate or to face the crisis is working in solidarity, trying to make more strengthen their activities, trying to support the natural disasters, as I said, that are increasing dramatically, and trying to find better markets for their crops in order to use the better prices in developed countries, to have better livelihoods by their own, and to make processes or activities to keep their soils, produce the microorganisms in their soils, to create and to protect the biomass that is so important for all the humans, but also trying to protect the water bodies. In our communities, it's so important for us to take care with water waste that we use in the crops. So we try to implement mechanisms to treat the water waste before to discard it again in the soil or in the water bodies.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Sandra. And I'm sorry to cut you off there. I would like to invite you to just extend that response in the chat box so that we don't miss out on any of the excellent insights that you could share beyond what is possible in the time that we have for the session. So to our panelists and all of the participants, that brings us to the end of this session. And thank you all for continuing to follow the day's proceedings. I would like to invite you again to visit the website facingthecrisis.spot, and also to share your favorite image on Twitter using the hashtag #facingthecrisis. And if you do this, of course, you don't need the incentive. It would be lovely that you receive a copy of Graeme Maxton's latest book. Over to you, Francis.
Thank you, Yankho, for that brilliant moderation. Thank you, Graeme, for reminding us that the whole world is suffering and the urgency of the situation. Thank you, Sandra, for reminding us of the protectors of the environment that we often forget in this discussion. And thank you, Jamie, for showing us what Scotland might be able to do if we can push our politicians a wee bit harder, perhaps. I hope you can all stay with us while we move on to look at some of the items from the exhibition itself. For this part, it's my pleasure to hand over to Maggie Nguyera. Maggie's a development and education practitioner with over 7 years of experience in project management, policy advocacy, teaching and research. She currently works with Trocare Malawi, coordinating the Climate Challenge Programme. Maggie's interest is in exploring processes and tools to address urban sustainability in pursuit of equitable development. Thank you, Maggie. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Francis. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming into this session. In this session, we are going to hear directly from the people behind the camera, and also in front of the camera, who have been showcased in this exhibition. The panelists, we have 4 panelists from all over, from the photos or entries that have been successful, and we have 4 of them. This exhibition is exploring 3 themes: the themes of impact, mitigation, and adaptation. It's my pleasure that I should introduce to you the three panelists, who are Chris Hoskins, Mai Chirwa, Ezra Milstein, but also Basil Wagrado. The first panelist that we're going to see is that we're going to hear from is Chris Hoskins. So Chris Hoskins is a photographer based in central Scotland. And international development and the work of the third sector has been important to Chris since before he ever picked up a camera. Chris has had the pleasure of working with many incredible organizations, including Tear Fund, Scotland, EMMS, Christian Aid, Christians Against Poverty, SU Scotland, and many more. So Chris's entry was a photo entry from Ethiopia called Obisa Afar.
Hi, thank you very much, Maggie. I'm not sure if the picture, I think the pictures just come up on screen there. So I met Obisa about a year and a half ago when I visited Ethiopia with Tear Fund. Obisa lives in Afar in Ethiopia, which is an incredibly brutal environment to live in. If you think of all the kind of cliches you might have ever seen when you've seen pictures of the desert, just random skulls and bits of bones that have been bleached by the sun, dust devils that wouldn't look out of place with Helen Hunt and Bill Paxton in front of them. It's just an absolutely incredibly harsh environment. I don't think I've ever been in a place where I've been so physically uncomfortable just trying to stand in the shade. I think in the shade it was something between 35 and 40 degrees. We met Obisa over a couple of days. We travelled with Tear Fund's partner in the area who are called Friendship Support Association, or FSA. They took us to Obisa's village, where we met with her and her family, and with some of the other families from the area as well. And we spent a couple of days just getting to know Obisa, hearing her story and learning about what it used to be like to live in her area and what it's like to live in that area now. So when we were there, it was meant to be the wet season. They'd been expecting the rains. We got there, we passed rivers where the cracks in the river were big enough for me to fit my hand into. It'd been incredibly dry for a long time. Obisa, her story is around water and the lack of water, or lack of available water. Instead of being able to walk just a few minutes to the river that was close by to their village to collect the water, Obisa and other women from the village were doing a 10-hour round trip to go gather water. And part of that journey is in the heat of the day, part of that journey is in the dark. It's in a part of the country where to get to the water, there's clans of hyena in the way, there's hippos and crocodiles in the water. So it's not just a really long, arduous journey, it's an incredibly dangerous journey to get there as well. It was incredibly humbling to hear Obisa's story, because Obisa is a pastoralist in Ethiopia. A pastoralist is essentially, they're shepherds. They have big herds of sheep that they look after. To get around, they either walk or they take a donkey. So as was being alluded to in the last session, their emissions are incredibly low. They're that group of vulnerable people who are making an incredibly small impact, if any, on the climate crisis, and yet they're taking the full brunt of it in terms of the climate change that they're facing and the hardship that they're having to face because of that. So it was absolutely, as I said, humbling to hear Obisa's story and to be able to share in that time with her and to spend some time just capturing some images and capturing some footage of her while we're there, so that we could share that story with Tear Fund's audience back here in Scotland, so that they can share about the impact of what's going on there, but also do a little bit to help the organisations that they work with in Ethiopia to help them to mitigate some of that, what they face.
Thank you very much, Chris, for giving us that show of the impact of climate change. So related to that is a program that Trokra Malawi and SCIAF is implementing, that is funded by the Scottish Government, which is called the Climate Challenge Program Malawi. So this program has been working in southern Malawi to build the resilience of the communities. It's using very exciting but also innovative solutions for the communities to find solutions to climate challenges. This film that you're going to see features the voices of the participants in the program. It shows how the CCPM has been able to build resilience into the impacts of climate change, which are some of them that Chris has just mentioned. The CCPM is a Scottish Government initiative helping rural communities in Malawi to find innovative solutions to problems caused by climate change.
If Malawi does not do anything else on climate change, Malawi might end up becoming a desert.
Climate change is something that affects everyone in Malawi, despite your economic status. Due to inadequate rainfalls, people are suffering, people are dying of hunger, people are starving.
I've seen a lot of impacts, mostly how these floods are affecting people. Why, as we all know, floods, when they come, the crops end up being washed away, and as a result, people end up staying with nothing else in terms of food.
Anali mavuto akulu mjigo sana bwere timapita kutali kukatunga mazi ake sokoma amuzithapwi. Ndipo saneneka olo inenene pamuta ndiona pali ne pandi ne osamba bwino. Ndipo ndachapa chifukwa cha mazi. Matenda ose ata.
Mongo upangiro umene tinalandira maphunziro, ndipo maphunziro amenewo amene tinafika nawo kuno ku skimu tinadzanso mbewu zokuti zithandizira ngati mphimbirawo kuti chinyontho chizitha kutani kusungika, komanso tinaphunzitsidwa kapangidwe ka manyowa.
Kusintha kwa nyengo ife anthu akwansoma kutibwezera mavuto takhuzika nako. So akesiki ifeyo kudera kwathu kuno. Bwino wa muzi wathu onse unodera lathu la kunoko kwansoma. Taunena kuti kuchaja mafoni, kumeta, mwina ana amatha kubwezedwa ku skulu, koma chifukwa choti zili pafupi amatha kubwezedwa, mwina ati mumeta mwachangu, mwina chosapezeka kuti wabwera ku skulu. Ndende zinthu zabwino obe anthu akudera kunoko. Mwina kupindula nazo kuzera mu chimenecho.
We need to focus on tomorrow, not today. So if the young people today get motivated and educated about climate justice, a change will be impacted.
Because every day, as we live, everyone hopes for the future. We all dream for the future. So we have to consider that I'm hoping for tomorrow. I will see tomorrow. But how will my environment be like tomorrow? What will surround me tomorrow? We have to be just to the environment. Of course, the environment can't speak on its own. It can't fight for its own, but we have to fight for it.
So in this session, what we really want to be able to come out is that we should be able to see the reality of climate change for the people and the communities across the world. So we've seen the communities in Ethiopia and we've seen the communities in Malawi, both under the theme of impact. And to the next theme, we have Maui Chirwa, who has an entry called The Circle of Life. Mai Chirwa is a staff associate lecturer in the environmental department of the University of Livingstonia in Malawi. She teaches forest, wildlife management, natural resources management, and conservation, and as well as population and environment. Mai is passionate about the environment, firmly believing that education, teamwork are key to dealing with climate change in Malawi and beyond. Mai is also a Thrives, one of the 5 Thrives directors.
Malawi is one of the poorest countries in Africa, where almost 60% of its population depend on agriculture for their livelihoods. And apart from that, we have high illiteracy levels. As a result, we have limited ways of generating livelihoods. This is why people opt for agriculture and also natural resources for their livelihoods.
20 years ago, the weather wasn't so hot as it is now. We got more from our farms than we do now. The fertility of our soil is getting worse, and the weather is too hot. My family lives off of what we grow, so although I have some money from other jobs, it's not enough to look after my family. The wanton cutting down of trees has also worsened the situation.
I worked with Mzuzu University and Thrive to analyze soils from Poka and Livingstonia for nutrients that are required to grow healthy crops. Most nutrients are very low, as shown by values that are below the red bars, which represent minimum requirements for healthy crops. Climate change will reduce these nutrients further because warm conditions increase the loss of nutrients from soils.
I felt climate change in February, when strong winds blew off the roof of my house and then destroyed bags of our maize, our beds, our blankets. My husband and I and our several children moved into our tiny kitchen building. I used to run a grocery business, but all my goods were destroyed. We have floods here almost every year because there are no trees. We need to increase literacy to help us farm more sustainably, look after trees and conserve our soils, and branch out from subsistence farming. This will help us cope better in a changed climate because it will reduce poverty while helping us manage our environment properly, which means it will stop making climate change worse.
Mai, would you help us understand, from your experience of relating to this film and the wider context in Malawi, which is the country where this film was made, what is the key message that you would want to share with the global leaders ahead of the COP26?
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to somehow be like an amplifier to the voices of people in the video that has been played. What I can tell them is that climate change is real. Climate change is not a myth. And we need to work together so that we can mitigate or adapt to this climate change issue. And apart from that, I just wanted to emphasize that we are all affected by climate change, be it in high-income countries as well as low-income countries. And I want to emphasize that the impacts or the burden is bared more by people in low-income countries, especially those countries like in sub-Saharan Africa, including Malawi, where we can say almost 60% or so, they are poor people who spend less than $1.25 a day. So I think there is need also to help people who are challenged in terms of finances, especially those in low-income countries.
Thank you very much. It looks to me like you are also reiterating what was also talked about in the first session, where we're looking at the issue of climate justice, to say that the people that are the least contributing to the causes of climate change are the ones that are facing the most of the blunt effects of climate change. Therefore, world leaders have to put in measures that would support the communities that are facing the worst effects of climate change, like communities like the ones that we've seen in the film that you contributed. Thank you very much. Our next panelist is Basil Ouagrado, whose entry is on the theme of adaptation as well. Basil is based in Burkina Faso and has been working as a voice from the field officer for WaterAid since August 2015. He collects and shares through audiovisual means the personal stories, the testimonies of communities in connection with the work that WaterAid is doing, with support from donors and partners. So Basil's entry is a photo of Razmat Pograwa in the community market garden. Basil, would you help us understand by telling us about the people in the photo and their story, but also the process by which this image was made?
Yeah, okay, of course. Thank you very much. I'm really happy to take part to this webinar and share my experience and also the experience of people I usually met in the field. So, who is Rasmata Pograwa? She is a lady that I met in May 2019. She is 39 years old now. She is a mother of 5 children, and she lives in the village called Zabandela, located in East Central region of Burkina Faso. I met her in her village during a trip to gather stories, as I usually do for WaterAid. And we got to talk. I have to meet her to understand her way of living and what she's doing to take care of her family. So she's like many women, like many other people in the village. She was living mainly from farming and market gardening in their village. So they make me living from agriculture, small animals, but also market gardening. And she is part of a women group working in this market gardening, community market gardening. And while she's working during the rainy season with her husband to grow crops such as maize, millet, cotton, During the dry season, she's only focused on market gardening to make income from crops growing. So, but what was the striking aspect of her story that related to climate change was the fact that she was facing a land degradation in her community, where they are growing crops, doing the market gardening. Compared to past years, the land was a bit degraded and they were struggling to produce more without using fertilizer to grow the onion, tomatoes, and so forth. So when you look at what Rasmata and her family rely on to make a living, it means that her destiny lies in the fate of weather and water and land. I will mainly focus on water and land because the concrete situation she was living when I met her was there, because she told me that whether in agriculture or market gardening, the main inputs, the most decisive factors for their production is the land and the water. Their quality and their quantity are determinant for them to be able to produce enough food for them and to sell and earn money. You know, so but the situation she was facing is the reduced soil fertility, making market gardening much harder for them and many other women who were working there. There were around 80 women working in the market garden. So the soil fertility was extremely reduced and they couldn't produce much more than before. So they have to spend a lot of money selling sometimes the breeding animals to buy fertilizers, to use them and to use it in the field and to use it in the market garden while they were producing the crops. So this was really affecting her benefits, her profitability, the profitability of their work. So she had the feeling that she's spending much more than she was earning. So, you know, a starved land cannot feed its people. So the poverty of the soil affects the lives of the men and the women who work it. So but the land degradation is due to many causes, but one of the reasons, the most important reason, was climate change, because this is a great problematic here in Burkina Faso. In general, we have soil is drying out and the loss of soil-borne nutrients is important. And it is said, many studies show that Burkina is experiencing this issue of land degradation. Almost 30 or 40% of our land is completely degraded. And
Basil,
yes,
I'm going to cut you short because we still have
yes.
one more to
Okay.
panelists to get to, but we'll get back to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. But what I'm seeing from the three entries so far is that the dependence on natural resources is what is making these communities very vulnerable to climate change. So like with the example of Brazil, the women are dependent on agriculture, which is a natural resource. So the environment, the degradation of the environment caused by climate change makes their lives a little more vulnerable to climate change, which is a little opposite to what we've been talking about earlier of using fossil fuels and all that. So there's different challenges that are being faced by different communities. So the interventions should be also suited to the different areas that we're working in. Our next panelist is Ezra Milstein. Ezra Milstein has worked as the senior global photographer at Mercy Corps since 2017, documenting the organization's work in over 40 countries. Ezra has created award-winning documentaries that have been featured in film festivals around the world. He lives in Amman, Jordan, with his wife Darla and daughter is Isabel. You can see his work at www.ezramilstein.com. Ezra's entry was building a better future through smart farming in Indonesia.
Thanks, Maggie. Thanks for including me in this great event, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. This photo is from March 2020. It's actually the last assignment I was on before being shut down by COVID for over a year. It's from Banyuwangi, Indonesia, which is all the way on the eastern side of Java. And for those who are familiar with Java, it's one of the most fertile places in the world. Most people make their living through agriculture, and that includes Tukeyam, who is in this photo. It's a precarious livelihood. It's subject to a lot of challenges, which has always included fluctuations in market prices, but now increasingly climate change is causing unpredictable weather like droughts, heavy rainfall, irregular seasonal shifts, and this has all resulted in decreased yields for farmers. And when they have unsuccessful harvests, it means less income, more instability, and frankly, they just don't have a ton of resources to cope with this. For example, Tukeyam, who's in the photo, doesn't earn enough money when that happens. Her family goes without the resources for emergencies and basic needs, and they have to cut back on essential expenses like food. The reality is she doesn't have a strategy to cope with this insecurity other than knowing she has to be successful. Farming is her only livelihood option. But at Mercy Corps, we're working with farmers groups in Indonesia to introduce new practices and technologies to help farmers adapt and thrive in the face of climate change. For example, we helped Tukeyam access and learn how to use the foil you see on the ground in this photo. When placed around the base of plants, the foil reflects sunlight back up to the plant, which increases photosynthesis. And it also helps to cool the soil around the plants, allowing them to retain moisture. This is one of many climate adaptations that farmers in this part of Indonesia are using. It's also what I think really makes this photo stand out, at least to me. The foil not only reflects light up to the plants, but also into Tukeyam's face. So there's light in her eyes. We can see her expression. Often in situations like this, photographing a farmer with a large hat casting shade on their face in the midday sun directly overhead, the farmer's face is completely in shadow. Adaptations like this are not only helpful for photographers, though, they're also helpful for farmers and allow them to build more secure lives for themselves and their children in the face of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ezra, for taking us through that photo. From what I see also, it's that when people are pressed between a hard place and a rock, they have to find means to make do with the situation. And that's one example of people adapting to the challenges that climate change is bringing about. I am not sure if we have any questions from the audience. If we do not have any questions from the audience, I have other questions to the panelists. So maybe we can start with Chris to help us understand what role can photography and film have in raising awareness on climate challenges, and how do we ensure that images and films tell the truth and give the voices to those in the pictures?
Thanks, Maggie. Just a small question there. I think part of it goes back to what Jamie mentioned earlier. Video and photography can say in a lot less space, and they can say a lot more in a lot less space than just words can. Being able to actually see the eyes of the people, the faces of the people who are being impacted by our actions in terms of climate change can be incredibly impactful. Being able to see the videos of how communities are being impacted, of the challenges that the communities are facing because of climate change, all of that. I'm a very visual person, as you're probably not surprised to hear, but all of that getting put together to be able to show people. I think photography and videography have a massive part to play in sharing with people just what the impact of climate change is having around the world, and why we actually have to take it seriously and make some sort of changes in our lives and in the way that our societies run. In terms of the second part of your question, just let me remind myself what I said. How do we ensure that images and films tell the truth and give voice to those in the pictures? I think part of that, probably the hardest part for those of us creating the images and the videos, is to not let our egos kind of get in the way, to make sure that the videos and the photos that we're taking are primarily about the people in them, to make sure that we keep it nice and simple, we keep it nice and basic, and we don't do anything fancy with things like Photoshop or all the kind of editing software that you have, that we just get a picture of the person, of the community, take the video as it is. We don't try and big things up to make them seem worse than they are. We don't try and take things away so that there's bits that might not be as comfortable to share in those videos. But it's just making sure that we take good images, we take good video, but make sure that we don't do anything to actually take away from the heart of what that story is there. Hopefully that makes sense there. But
okay, so truly representing the people that you are taking the images of. I think just to remind us that if we are on Twitter, if we're sharing, yes, let's use the hashtag facing the crisis, and let's share the pictures or the images that are of interest to us. And there's a book to be won. For Ezra and Maui and Baziwa as well, what are the striking aspects of the visual stories you were part of, in terms of how they demonstrate, if depending on the theme that you're working on, if it's impact, adaptation, or mitigation? So what are the most striking aspects of the stories or the you were part of? Maybe we can start with Mai.
Thank you very much, Maggie. The striking aspects, it has to do with poor people in low-income countries, depending more on agriculture, as well as natural resources and small-scale businesses for their livelihoods. And what is happening is like there is a vicious cycle where the impacts of climate change are increasing the levels of poverty, and at the same time, the levels of poverty are increasing the challenges of climate change. So it's like there's a vicious circle, especially in low-income countries. And to break that cycle, we're depending on education. We believe that education will enlighten the people on how best they can manage the available resources. At the same time, education is like it will widen their livelihood options. And not only that, education will also help people to look after their trees better, even to migrate from traditional subsistence farming to conservation agriculture. So we are relying on education as one of the tools that can break the cycle. Of course, there are also other options. Yeah, so that's what the video, the striking aspects of the video that we have just seen.
All right, thank you very much. Ezra, would you want to quickly add to that?
Yeah, I would say that it, to echo what Chris said in particular, I feel like it personalizes what can feel like a very abstract issue, which is the key to connecting with people and getting them to really care about things about climate change. Visually speaking, I think the juxtaposition of farming, which of course has been going on for much of human history, with a more modern intervention that can help solve the climate crisis is very interesting to see. And I think we'll probably see more of that in terms of just seeing how adaptations are inserted into everyday life.
Great, thank you very much. So the pictures being able to personalize or to put in a clear, visible aspect, the things that would are very abstract, we would say. So the issue of adaptation, we are able to see them through the films and to able to clearly understand them through the pictures. Basil, I would invite you to respond to the same question, but also we have a question from the audience. So when you're responding to this, also tackle this one, which is asking, they say that it was great to hear Rasmata's story, and they would want to understand what work that Action Aid has done in her community to help them adapt to the impacts of climate change.
Well, okay. I think in Rasmata's community, one of the striking aspect I already talked about it. It's land degradation due to drought and also climate change in general. But it's underlying the vulnerability of communities, their dependence on natural resources, because they mainly live from natural resources, agriculture. So the land, the water is the most important inputs to produce and have food to take care of the family. But land and water are being affected by climate change. So there is poverty in land, poverty in water. The lack of water is also an issue, big issue. So it becomes difficult for communities to keep producing enough food for themselves. So what has been done for this community to help them cope and adapt to climate change? I think WaterAid implemented a great project in this area covering Rasmata village, which was based on water resources management. And the project included one of the components was also sanitation, because we trained community to better understand water cycle, to use tools to try to measure water resources like the wells and also the rainfall, using some technical tools. They have been trained for that, and we have supported them with wash facilities, among them boreholes, but also what we call the eco-san latrine, ecological sanitations latrine. And eco-san latrines have been particularly built in Rasmata village to help the women who were working on market gardening to use, because the eco-san turned the feces into fertilizer, to help them reduce the expenses they put in fertilizer, to buy fertilizer. So the project helped them build eco-sun latrine, and they are using the experiment which are being turned into fertilizer to grow crops. So this was a great hope for them to get this eco-sun latrine, as it helped them reduce the expenses on fertilizers.
Thank you very much, Basil. So what we're getting from this session is that there's underlying causes of vulnerability, which are being amplified by climate change. But we have been able to clearly see the impacts, the adaptation measures, but also the mitigation measures that have been enabled through the visual, through the pictures, through film, that as we have been able to see through this from the different contributors. At this point, I would like to close the session and hand over this to Francis. Thank you very much to the panelists, and thank you to everyone who joined this session.
Thank you, Maggie, for your great facilitation. I know it's really unfair to cut people off when you've got such wonderful stories to tell. And also because we all learn so much from hearing about the story behind the pictures. So I'd like to again thank Chris and Moai and Basil and Ezra for helping us understand some of those stories behind the pictures, because I think whilst we can all agree that the pictures are very powerful, and that is the message that we're trying to get across and that we hope others in looking at the exhibition will get. Nevertheless, I think those of you who've been good enough to stay to the end, we've also understood a lot more because you've helped us tell the story behind the pictures. And if I have a big takeaway for me, it was about, from the whole session, it's about soil degradation. I think many of us think of climate change in terms of floods and fires, as Graeme described at the beginning, and maybe in terms of fossil fuels, but we don't always think about the impact. And it's been very powerful to hear about the impact. So I'd like to thank you all, everybody who is in both sessions, for really helping us understand. I'd like to encourage you all to look at all the images in the rest of the exhibition, to share it with your friends and colleagues, and try and get people to think a bit more about what is really happening in the world as a result of what we all do every day. And keep tweeting. And thank you very much for joining us. And thank you everyone again. Thank you.